In Chapter 2, we're going to discuss how to identify competitive advantage and specifically how to use information technology to achieve competitive advantage. And we're going to first describe what is competitive advantage, and we're going to use Michael Porter's 5 force model to guide us in thinking about how IT can be used in achieving competitive advantages. Porter also has 3 generic strategies and help us to compete in the marketplace. And last but not the least, we're going to describe the relationship between business, process, and the so-called value chain. For organizations to survive and to succeed, they must use different means to achieve competitive advantage. The so-called competitive advantage is the use of a product, services, or other mechanism for an organization to deliver higher value for its customer such that they can be more profitable. And if a company knows how to use some emerging technology to their advantage, that usually will give them a so-called first mover advantage. However, using an emerging technology comes with great risk because of unfamiliarity of the technology itself. An organization need to constantly watch out for the competitive force in the marketplace. That's usually done through some kind of environmental scanning, which means obtain industry-wide information, intelligence to find out what their competitors are doing, what are the driver in the marketplace, and how they can use some emerging technology to help them to achieve competitive advantage. And there are 3 common tools which we're going to discuss in this chapter regarding how we can think about the so-called competitive advantage. As we mentioned earlier, the first one is Porter's 5 force model, and once again it's Porter's 3 generic strategy, and last is the value chain model, also from Michael Porter, who is a professor from Harvard Business School. First is Michael Porter's 5 force model, which determines the relative attractiveness of industry in terms of how they may compete. First, and pretty obvious, companies are competing with their competitor in the same industry. And the other 2 potential competing forces are buyer and supplier. And if there's a dominant buyer in the marketplace, like Walmart sitting here buying something from its supplier, then Walmart has much higher bargaining power over its supplier. However, company can, for instance, develop a strong link to its customer by providing an online ordering information system, make it very easy for the buyer to use, such that it become part of the customer's internal information system. Then it will be very difficult for the customer to switch to another supplier. In this case, the company has increased its bargaining power over its buyer. And on the supply side, if a company is building up a very efficient supply chain and also identify multiple sourcing options and working with selected suppliers, and potentially the company over here can increase its bargaining power over its supplier. However, if a supplier has a proprietary unique technology that the company have to have, in that case the suppliers will have a higher bargaining power over the company is supplying the product to. Company also have to look into the potential substitute product or services that may be threatening its competitiveness. For instance, the iPad from Apple is competing directly to some notebook computer vendor. Another thing a company needs to watch out for is the threat of new entrants. The new entrants could be actually your supplier, which decided to integrate to downstream. It could be your existing customer who decided that you're making too much money, and they decided to move upstream and integrate some of the upstream activity, producing certain component that they used to purchase. And it could be other entrants which can be even from a totally different industry. For instance, Apple Computer was a computer company but decided to go into consumer electronics industry and competing with some existing firms by selling iPod, a kind of a portable electronic device for listening to music. So one thing that you have to think about is how you can use information technology to help you to compete with all those 5 forces out there. And you want to reduce your buyer's power, and one way to do it is to increase the switching cost, make the customer unwilling or very costly for them to switch to another vendor. One way to do it is to develop a loyalty program like frequent mileage program offered by the airline. And since the customer has accumulated a lot of mileage, they're more reluctant to switch to another airline, and that increases the company's bargaining power over its customer. Supplier's power is assessed by the supplier's ability to impact the price they're charging for the component they're selling to the company. As I mentioned, if they have proprietary solution, then they can pretty much determine the price they want to charge. However, if there are multiple sourcing alternative, then the supplier's power will be much less. However, running a very efficient supply chain from the supplier to the manufacturer to its customer may benefit actually all parties involved. The threat of substitute product and services is very high when there are some alternative to your product and services. So one way you need to think about is how you can make your product and service unique and difficult to replace to reduce the threat from this particular force. The threat of new entrants. You want to increase the threat. You want to actually build up the barrier to reduce the threat for new entrants. The entry barrier, if you can develop high entry barrier, then the competitor would less likely to enter the marketplace. For instance, iPad or iPhone and iPod from Apple Computer. Apple has developed iTunes that allow its iPod user to download music, and it will be very difficult for other vendor to build the iTunes website and sign licensing from music industry company, and so the entry barrier is extremely high, and that gives Apple computer a competitive advantage. The rivalry among existing competitor, if one way to develop high barrier is try to provide product differentiation, and which is unique, so that existing competitor may not offer similar product like yours, therefore you can charge higher price or have some advantage over your competitors. Let's use airline industry as example. Airline industry, because customer have many choices, so the bargaining power for the customer will be higher, and at the same time there are only a few airplane and engine manufacturers, like Boeing, Airbus from Europe, for the airline to purchase airline. Therefore, suppliers' power over the airline in companies is also very high, and the threat of substitute product and services for the airline industry is also very high, particularly for shorter term distance travel, because people can take train or driving themselves. Therefore, the threat is also quite high. Starting a new airline certainly costs a lot of money. However, new company can come to the marketplace by leasing airplane and start some popular route to start with. So you were seeing a lot of cheap airfare new airline companies started quite frequently. So the threat of new entrants can be pretty high as well. And airline industry are competing with each other quite a bit, and particularly on the pricing side, which reduce the profitability of all the airline in the same industry. Let's look at the second model from Porter regarding three generic strategy which a company can consider in competing in the marketplace. And first strategy is cost leadership. If company can use information technology, reduce the cost in providing product or services to its client, then they may have the so-called cost leadership. Walmart is a good example of a company who has a very efficient supply chain and have the so-called everyday lowest price offering to its customer, and therefore again the cost leadership in the retail marketplace. However, you don't have to compete in terms of pricing or cost. If you can use information technology to differentiate your offering with your competitor, then potentially you can charge higher price. Another way to look at the generic strategy is look at whether you want to target your product service or services to the broader market or to the narrow market. And a lot of time for new entrants, since you have limited resources, try to have a focused strategy to target a particular narrow market, could give you better competitive advantage. Here in the textbook, the author used different brands of car as example to illustrate the three generic strategy. Honda is usually cheaper than its competitor, so they are using the so-called cost leadership actually target the broader market. And Kia is focusing only on very specific focus market. Hummer, very expensive and very low gas mileage, as I may mention and alert to you. However, they use the differentiation strategy due to its uniqueness in the marketplace. The last strategy or model actually provided by Porter is the value chain model. A company need to think about its business process, and those processes are organized along the so-called value chain. So let's look at the value chain model. Before we do that, we can also combine the previous two models by Porter, which is cost leadership, differentiation, and have a focus market, and cross-reference that to the 5 forces, which is entry barrier, buyer power, supplier power, threat of substitute, and rivalry within the same industry. And we can look at various strategy which may apply actually to the generic strategy and also address one of the 5 forces in the competitive force. So as example, if we have the customer loyalty program established, then we can differentiate ourselves from our competitor, and this will actually make it very difficult for other competitors to enter into the marketplace. At the same time, I would say this strategy would actually reduce the buyer's power because they're locked into the kind of loyalty program and have vested interest in purchasing product or services from us. This is the value chain model. We classify major processes or activities into 2 categories. One is the supporting activity, the other is the primary activity. The primary activity, thinking about the production process, one is we usually call it inbound logistic, which we are actually getting shipment from our supplier. Then we will make or produce the product and services, and then followed by outbound logistics, which we would deliver the product and services to our customer. And in order to attract customer to come and purchase our product and services, marketing and sales will be a necessary activity. And also we shouldn't forget about after sales services that we need to offer to our customer. So that's the primary activity along the value chain. Some supporting activity including procurement, technology, and research and development, and certainly information technology belong to this category as well. And we also need to focus on human resource management and building up the general infrastructure for the firm. Depends on your industry. If you're, say, a consulting firm, hiring the best talent and retaining them and provide best training to them become a primary activity to consulting firm. In this case, human resource management probably should be considered a primary value activity instead of a supporting activity. And when you assess your investment in information technology, you need to think about which activity that this information technology application will contribute to, and how much that is going to add value to your company. So here we're combining Porter's 5 force model with the value chain. From the inbound logistics side, that's supplier power. For the outbound logistic marketing and sales and services, that allow us to deal with the buyer's power. And if we build out a very strong infrastructure, then we can potentially make it very difficult for our new entrants to duplicate similar structure to compete with us. So this concludes our discussion of Chapter 2.